Welcome back to Talk Jamaica. We're streaming live at www.talkjamaicaradio.com. My name is Ricardo Brooks. Listeners, it's now time for part 2 of our discussion segment. In Washington, D.C., at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, Jamaica was summoned to respond to allegations of human rights abuses of at-risk groups and human rights defenders. Jamaica was represented by Ambassador Stephen Vassiani. He's the ambassador to Washington and permanent representative to the Organization of American States. Also with him was Mrs. Julia Hyatt. They noted that the government's human rights perspective was influenced by a number of factors, including the strong desire to give full effect to rights enshrined in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, as well as international treaties to which the state is a party. They went further to highlight the human rights challenges and the subsequent reform efforts associated with current economic realities, access to justice, police killings, LGBT issues, and general CARICOM human rights involvement. However, members of the Commission and local human rights defenders have issues with the posture of Jamaica, especially with statements made that many human rights defenders exaggerate their perceived persecution by government entities. We will get exclusive reactions right now from Rodje Malcolm. He is one of the directors of Jamaicans For Justice. Good afternoon, Rodje.
Good afternoon, Ricardo, and good afternoon to the listeners.
All right. Rodje, Ralston here. Let me throw the first question to you. What really was the intended outcome of the hearing? Where we see Jamaica being summoned to the Commission in regards to human rights abuses?
Okay, so to give you a bit of background, the Commission issued a report in 2012 on the situation of human rights in Jamaica, as it does for several of the states under the IECHR. In March, the Commission held a hearing to look at the recommendations coming from that report and to assess the state's response. In March, JFJ did a detailed written submission on the different thematic areas in the report with specific reference to data and reports that we had received to our office that suggest either improvements or non-implementation. And then what happened last week, the Commission, on its own initiative, I'd like to point that out, that this was on the Commission's own initiative, scheduled another follow-up hearing into what had taken place in March. So the purpose is to monitor the state's implementation of the report and its response to the findings, with the hope that there's going to be improvement in the situation for the impacted groups and on state policy laws, you name it, the report has several chapters. So the Commission intends to monitor the state's response to the report and assess the steps it has taken, obviously with the aim of, suggesting further improvements or recognizing improvements where they have taken place. And there have been improvements in certain situations.
Rodje, do hearings like these usually have any significant impact on changing the status quo in the countries called before the Commission?
Yes, in some regards, and no in some other regards. Insofar as international mechanisms sometimes generally do have limited domestic impact. It has an impact in terms of reminding the international community and the public back home to keep issues alive. The IECHR has, in different ways, have had effects on advocacy areas that we have been working on, most notably last year with the precautionary measures that the IECHR issued on behalf of the girls that were incarcerated in adult prisons at Fort Augusta and Horizon. Due to that process and the pressure put on the government, due to the urgency of that process, the girls were removed from Fort Augusta and Horizon most expeditiously to South Camp, a process that had been stalling for about 2 years. And it was mainly through the international action that JFJ had taken on behalf of that population that really sped up that process and forced the country to recognize that there are persons watching the human rights situation. In others, it's a good indicator to the government as to what to focus on. Sometimes the government, may not be aware of the gravity of certain issues, and I think the credibility coming from the IECHR helps to put a laser on those issues. And in some respects, the government has adopted changes and recommendations from the IECHR and other international organizations that we've seen positive changes on the ground. For example, recently we have the merger of the Forensic Science Division and the Legal Medical Unit, and the intention to remove it from the budgetary control of the JCF so that we have our forensics and autopsies not being, operations not being controlled by the JCF, which of course we know has been a recipe for impunity. So there have been steps that have been taken that, it's important to recognize those. We think the pace of change has been, lurching from crisis to crisis has been far too slow. But to paint it as simply, that the abuses have taken place and only abuses, I think it's a knock that we as human rights groups get sometimes, and sometimes it's legitimate, and we have to be careful, and I'd concede this easily. We have to be careful to also highlight positive changes where they have taken place. But overall, my assessment has been far inadequate. It's been very inadequate, and not enough has been done regarding the well-documented structural problems in Jamaica.
Mm-hmm. Tell us, if you will, Rodje Malcolm, representing JFJ, what were the main points of your address to the forward the position of Jamaicans for Justice?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear a little bit of that got cut off. Or main points regarding what?
Regarding JFJ's position as you put it forward to the session.
Okay, yes, so we mainly spoke about the issues that we raised in our March report and the non-action regarding them, and we used Mario Dean's beating and subsequent death based in custody as essentially the framework for it. So we spoke extensively about detention issues that persist that have been documented by JP and other organizations, and how these things have flared up, mainly in Mario Dean, and if the government had taken adequate steps in, making structural changes regarding a single statutory regulation on detention and bail that has been systematically breached by police officers, if RMs and JPs provided the oversight they were supposed to provide via legal mandate, if our police lockups no longer arbitrarily and summarily and many times illegally detain more persons than they were meant to detain, and oftentimes without a warrant, we wouldn't have filthy, crowded, dangerous, and inhumane detention conditions that we provide oversight for, which Mario was brutalized and eventually died from. We spoke very extensively about police killings and impunity, recognizing the somewhat decrease that we've had currently in 2004, but recognizing that on average 3 civilians have been killed weekly in Jamaica since the start of the year. The low rate of conviction and the defense he was on earlier, speaking about that. And the issues that we have that have undermined INDECOM's ability to be an independent oversight mechanism, particularly actions that the police still carry out. For example, the High Command maintaining the right that police officers have the opportunity to collude on statements before presenting them. The fact that police still give the orders for post-mortems and examinations and ID parades that create serious conflicts of interest that scare away witnesses very oftentimes, that they don't call INDECOM until hours after a fatal killing when the opportunity is there to plant evidence or tamper with it. We also spoke about children in detention, a major issue for the Commission, obviously, which worked last year with the precautionary measures and cases we've brought before the Commission center around violations of human rights for children who are deprived of liberty, or data dating back to 2011 on all the police logs from every single police station in the country dealing with children, their date of entry, their next court date, the offense, number of days spent in custody. We have cases where children have spent up to 141 days in custody. The legal limit on the bail act is 2 days. The Child Care Protection Act is 24 hours. On average, or analysis, and a rough analysis, and the most conservative estimate was children spend an average 8 days in a police lockup. And this is disaggregated data, including children who are in there for care and protection, children who are there deemed, quote-unquote, before the was removed uncontrollable, and children in there for offenses. These are on their faces human rights violations and violations of domestic law. And we spoke about other issues, children in detention, correctional facilities, children's homes. Critical incidents in children's homes are still too high. Far too many instances of sexual critical incidents in children's homes. And this is dating back to data from 2011 to this year. Still having literally hundreds of critical incidents in the children's homes, and these are children who are in the care of the state. We don't think it's appropriate to have human rights abuses for the most vulnerable group while they're in state care. So those are the main issues. Far more detailed in the written submissions, and I don't want to take up all the time reiterating the entire presentation, but essentially to demonstrate the aspects of our March report and IACHR 2012 report that have not been in any meaningful way acted upon, and in which situation we have human rights violations being entrenched.
Rodje, let me ask you your immediate reaction, or your reaction at the time, to Ambassador Vassiani's claim that human rights groups in Jamaica are exaggerating the extent of the threat?
Okay, so I'd like to address this threat issue. I think that the words that we use are very important, and I think when we first said, JFJ has been threatened with legal action since 2013 in our child rights advocacy, and it came up again this year with the Children's Home Program. Somehow in that discussion, I don't know if it was a translation issue because some of the commissioners don't speak English, that the term changed from human rights defenders being persecuted and a term changed from human rights defenders being criminalized. While I think that there's serious gravity to the suggestions of criminal action against human rights defenders, I don't think JFJ went so far as to say that we have been persecuted or criminalized by the state. I think that would be a irresponsible assessment. I made a presentation, that's not what I said, and that wasn't something that JFJ has ever said, that we have been criminalized or persecuted. So that would be an exaggeration. However, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that JFJ was not threatened with legal action. In 2013, right before we got the precautionary measures for serious violations of child rights, we did a petition to the government, to Lisa Hanna, to Minister Mark Golding, to Minister Peter Bunting, and to the Office of the Prime Minister. And it was an online petition, and it was disseminated internationally. And the government held a press conference in which they said we are maligning their integrity, we're embarrassing them, we are being dishonest, and they're going to try to refer us to the Attorney General to see what action they can take against us. So we thought that was, a few weeks after the IACHR recognized all those issues as valid and granted precautionary measures for the children who we were petitioning about, so they weren't invalid claims. But then again this year with the issue that regarding the children's homes, we have, and this is just documented easily, we have the minister saying that she has referred JFJ to the children's advocate to see what the children's advocate can do legally under her authority to prosecute, and also to the Attorney General's office to see what that office can do to prosecute. And then we have the police saying that they're investigating for possible criminal sanctions. And we'd like to know what the results of all of these referrals are. I would love for the government to make it public, because I'm still waiting to find out if there's some gravity of JFJ's purported abuses or violations of laws that have never been specified. Then make it public. We've always been a favor of transparency, even if it relates to us. So I as a commission, call upon the government to let all of these referrals and investigations be known to the public. And it would be very unfortunate if the investigations and referrals come back and show no violations of law, because what it would do, it would demonstrate exactly what the IACHR's focus for this year is regarding human rights defenders, which is the use and abuse of criminal law and threats of criminal law as a method that states use to stifle human rights work. And it's a dangerous international trend that I hope Jamaica isn't falling victim to, because human rights activists should not be threatened unless there are legitimate violations of law in the course of their work. And if there are legitimate violations of law, let them be known publicly. I'm perfectly willing to stand by and respond to them if they were to come. But thus far, all we've heard is a referral, very public statements from the government, and then complete silence upon any investigation of that nature. So I hope the media pays a very close attention to these things and points a laser at the government to make good on their threats, because they haven't thus far.
All right, so the hearing has concluded now, Rodje. What is the next step for JFJ? The
next step for JFJ is to continue our local advocacy. We have 285 active cases before the courts right now. We have about 15 cases before the IACHR, so we're looking for action on the cases before the IACHR. Some of these cases have been in the media. One of the Kemar Walters case, for example, Boulevard shooting, that is one case before the IACHR. Janice Allen, several cases for a few years now we've had before the IACHR. Our most notable case, obviously, was the Michael Gale case. That I think the judgment came back in 2007. Very important judgment, the Michael Gale case from the IACHR. So we have cases there that we're continuing to pursue. We'll continue our local advocacy or local research into human rights issues, and reporting to the states and international organizations where we find abuses. It is our hope that the state acts on them, and we recognize that there are financial constraints. However, not everything is a financial constraint. For example, at IACHR, Ambassador Vassiani rightfully mentioned that there are constraints. We recognize those, but said that one of the reasons why we have purported cruel and inhumane conditions in prisons is because of financial constraints. And we disagreed, saying that the government itself has documented, at least in March in the Auditor General's report, that prisons are overcrowded not because of finances, but because the prisons fail to do the assessment to transfer prisoners to medium and low security prisons. So in fact, what we have is medium and low security prisons in Jamaica are underpopulated by between 43 to 51%, while Tower Street and St. Catherine, the two main maximum security prisons, which is a default place for all prisoners to go, even if you simply stole an item in, because the prisons have failed administratively to do what they need to do, then we have certain prisons being overcrowded and others being underpopulated. That isn't an issue of cost. So I think we have to really be careful that we just assert cost as the pervasive and all-encompassing justification as to why we can't make ground on human rights issues. We do quite a bit to comply with IMF law, legislative speed. We force things through government and through parliament at a very alarming rate, in my opinion. I think in the past year, we have seen the capacity of the state to actually pass law expeditiously. So now we know they can do it, but we wait 10 years for the Disabilities Act. We're still waiting on the Occupational Health and Safety Act. We don't know when the child diversion policy will be finally passed, and we're still waiting on the review of the Child Care Protection Act, not to mention education regulations from 1980, which charges teachers $50 for breaching the right to education. But we can pass revenue administration within 2 months. So I don't think it's always an issue of cost. I think it's an issue of the value and priority hierarchy that we have created in the country. And human rights, I don't think, is at the top of that list, or is at least in the top realm of that list. Until it becomes a major concern, JFJ will continue to advocate and agitate around these issues.
Rodje, as usual, we want to thank you for taking the time out and joining us here on Talk Jamaica to really discuss issues surrounding human rights. And we know that these issues will not go away, so we'll be calling on you again to even give us more clarity.
All right, thanks. Thanks for having me.
All right, listeners, in case you are just joining us, we have been talking to Rodje Malcolm. He's the director of Jamaicans For Justice. We will take a break, and when we come back, it will be time for Talk Vault.